In the wide open plains of the American West, where the land stretches as far as the eye can see and the sky is a deep, endless blue, there lived a cowboy named Thomas. He wasn't a famous man or someone rich and powerful, but he was well known among the nearby towns and villages for his honest heart and helpful nature. Thomas was in his late 20s with sunburned skin from years of working under the hot sun and eyes as calm as a quiet river. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin just outside a dusty little town. The town didn't have many people, just a few farmers, a blacksmith, a schoolhouse, a general store, and some wandering travelers, but everyone there respected Thomas. Thomas wasn't like other cowboys who only cared about horses, cattle, or saloons. He believed in kindness, fairness, and helping others whenever he could. Ever since he was a boy, he had been fascinated by stories of the land, nature, and the different cultures that called the wild frontier their home. While some settlers feared or looked down on Native American tribes, Thomas was different. He believed that everyone deserved respect, no matter where they came from or what language they spoke. He often rode his chestnut horse, Dusty, across the prairies and hills. To enjoy the beauty of the natural world, he would follow winding trails through forests, cross shallow rivers, and camp beneath the stars. Sometimes, on his rides, he would come across members of nearby tribes, like the Apache or Navajo, who lived in the surrounding lands. Many of them were cautious at first, unsure of how to react to a white man riding through their territory. But over time, they began to recognize Thomas not just as a cowboy, but as someone who meant no harm. Thomas always greeted them with a gentle nod or a warm smile. He had even picked up a few words of their language and tried to learn about their customs and beliefs. Sometimes, he traded small goods like dried meat or herbs, and in return, the tribal elders would tell him old stories passed down through generations. These peaceful encounters made him feel like he was part of something bigger than just himself and his cabin. He admired the deep connection the tribes had with the land, the way they respected nature, honored their ancestors, and lived in harmony with the world around them. Though Thomas lived a quiet life, he never felt lonely. He had Dusty to keep him company, the open land to explore, and the stars above him to guide his thoughts. At night, sitting by a small fire outside his cabin, he would often think about the meaning of life, kindness, and the importance of understanding others. He believed that even in a world full of struggle, war, and hardship, small acts of goodness could make a big difference. People in town often joked that Thomas had an old soul, someone who didn't care much for modern comforts but cared deeply for people and nature. He didn't have a family of his own, but he treated everyone like a brother or sister, especially those who were poor, lost, or in need. Whether it was helping an old woman carry firewood, guiding a lost traveler, or giving his lunch to a hungry child, Thomas never hesitated to do what he believed was right. It was during one of his winter rides through the snowy forest trails that Thomas's life took an unexpected turn. He had no idea that a simple decision, one small act of kindness, would change everything forever. The snow was falling gently that day, covering the earth in a soft white blanket. The trees stood tall and quiet, and the wind whispered through the branches like a song from another world. And in that peaceful silence, something, or rather, someone would soon cross his path and lead him down a road he never imagined walking. It was one of the coldest days of the winter. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the sharp bite of frost. Thick gray clouds covered the sky like a heavy blanket, blocking out the warmth of the sun. Snow lay deep across the land, covering everything in a silent, white sheet. The tall pines stood still, their branches weighed down by fresh snow, and the ground crunched loudly under the horses' hooves as Thomas rode slowly through the forest trail. Wrapped in his thick wool coat and scarf, Thomas could still feel the chill creeping into his bones. Even his horse, Dusty, snorted and shook his mane now and then, clearly uncomfortable in the bitter cold. But Thomas wasn't one to stay indoors all day, even during harsh weather. He had always found peace in nature's quiet, and he often used these rides to think and clear his mind. As he followed a narrow trail between two frozen hills, something unusual caught his eye. Off to the side of the path, near a cluster of leafless bushes, was a small shape barely moving. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a fox curled up to stay warm. But as he looked closer, his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a child, a girl. She was sitting on the snowy ground, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. Her long black hair was tangled and covered in snowflakes. She wore a thin, tattered dress, completely unfit for the freezing weather. Her bare feet were red and swollen from the cold, and her body trembled uncontrollably. Her head was bowed, and she didn't seem to notice him approaching. Thomas quickly brought Dusty to a stop and jumped down from the saddle. His boots crunched into the snow as he rushed toward the girl. "Hey there," he said gently, not wanting to scare her. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer. She just shivered and stared at the ground, too cold and weak to speak. He could see the pain in her face, the way her lips had turned blue, and her hands were stiff from frostbite. Without hesitation, Thomas took off his thick wool blanket from the back of his saddle and knelt beside her. "It's all right," he said in a calm, soothing voice. "You're safe now." Carefully, he wrapped the blanket around her small frame. The blanket was warm from his body heat and thick enough to cover her completely. She looked up at him. For the first time, her dark eyes wide and full of confusion, but also hope. Thomas offered her a smile. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't say anything, but she nodded slightly, holding the blanket tightly around her, as if it were the only thing keeping her alive, and maybe it was. He sat beside her for a moment, shielding her from the wind with his body. In that quiet moment, surrounded by snow and silence, he felt a deep sadness for the girl. Who was she? Why was she out here all alone in such dangerous weather? Was she lost? Or had something terrible happened? Looking at the patterns of beads in her hair and the way her dress was sewn, Thomas realized she must be from the nearby Apache tribe. He had seen similar clothing before during his visits near their village. But the tribe lived miles from here. Why would a child from the tribe be all alone in the middle of the forest? Questions flooded his mind, but one thing was clear. This girl needed help, and fast. Her tiny body was barely surviving the cold. He knew he couldn't leave her here. So, he gently lifted her in his arms, careful not to startle her, and carried her toward Dusty. As he placed her on the saddle and climbed up behind her to keep her steady, she leaned back slightly into his chest. It was the first sign of trust, and Thomas didn't take it lightly. He wrapped the blanket even tighter around her and urged Dusty forward, back toward his cabin, hoping he wasn't too late. As they made their way back through the snowy forest, Thomas held the girl close to keep her warm. The wind continued to blow through the trees, but the thick blanket and his body heat helped protect her from the worst of it. She was still shivering, but not as violently now. Every now and then, he could feel her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket, clinging to it like it was her last hope. Thomas didn't say much during the ride. He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions, and besides, she didn't seem ready to speak. He could feel that she was frightened, not just from the cold, but maybe from something else too. Her eyes, when she had looked up at him in the forest, had been filled with more than just fear. There was confusion, sadness, and a deep kind of loneliness that hurt to see in someone so young. After about 30 minutes of riding through thick snow and icy wind, Thomas finally spotted the wooden fence that marked the edge of his land. His cabin sat on a small hill, surrounded by bare trees and open space. Smoke was rising from the chimney, a sign that the fire he had left earlier was still burning. Thank goodness, he thought, she needed that warmth right away. He guided Dusty to the stable beside the cabin and gently climbed down. Then, with great care, he lifted the girl from the saddle, keeping the blanket wrapped tightly around her. Her body was still cold, but he could feel some life returning to her. Her eyes fluttered open again, and this time, when she looked at him, there was something new in her gaze, maybe trust, or at least curiosity. "You're safe now," he whispered softly. "Let's get you inside." He carried her up the wooden steps and opened the cabin door with his elbow. A wave of warmth rushed out to greet them. The small fireplace in the corner was glowing, casting a soft orange light across the room. The cabin was simple, but cozy, just one large room with a bed, a table, a few chairs, shelves with supplies, and a rug made of animal hide on the wooden floor. Thomas walked straight to the fireplace and gently set the girl down on a thick fur blanket near the hearth. She stayed quiet, wrapping the wool blanket tighter around her as if afraid it would be taken away. Thomas quickly stoked a fire and added another log to make sure it would keep burning strong. After a few moments, he went to a cabinet and poured some warm water from a kettle into a tin cup. He knelt beside her and offered it. "Here," he said kindly, "it's just warm water for now. You need to drink something." The girl hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the cup. Her fingers trembled, but she managed to hold it steady. She took a small sip, then another, and finally looked up at him with a slight nod of thanks. Thomas smiled gently. "You don't have to talk yet, just rest." He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions like what her name was, where she came from, or why she had been alone in the snow. Those would come later. For now, all that mattered was making sure she was safe, warm, and cared for. He took another blanket and draped it over her shoulders, then placed a few soft pieces of bread and dried berries in a small wooden bowl and set it near her. As he sat on the floor across from her, the cabin quiet except for the gentle crackling of the fire, he noticed something change in her expression. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something gentler, almost like gratitude. She still didn't speak, but she no longer looked afraid of him. Thomas leaned back against the wall and let out a quiet sigh. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her into that forest. But he knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing. And sometimes, that's all a person can do. Thomas spent most of the afternoon making sure the girl was comfortable. He added more wood to the fire, made a small pot of warm soup, and stayed nearby in case she needed anything. She didn't speak, but she listened quietly and followed his gentle instructions. As the warmth returned to her body, some color came back to her cheeks. She slowly sipped the soup and kept the blanket wrapped tightly around her like a protective shell. Thomas didn't push her to talk. He figured she'd speak when she was ready. As the day turned into evening, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. Inside the cabin, though, it was peaceful. The fire glowed, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Thomas sat near the fireplace, whittling a piece of wood with his knife, while the girl rested on the fur blanket nearby, her eyes following the flickering flames. He still didn't know her name or how she'd ended up alone in the snow, but there was no doubt in his mind that she was from one of the nearby Apache tribes. He had seen people wearing similar beadwork and traditional stitching during his travels. He knew their village wasn't far, maybe a few miles through the woods. Thomas had always respected the tribe, though most settlers kept their distance out of fear or ignorance. He had tried to be kind and fair to everyone, regardless of their background. He thought about taking her back the next day. She would be safer with her family, surrounded by her own people. Surely they would be looking for her. He just needed to wait for the weather to calm a bit. Maybe by morning, the snow would let up enough for him to guide her home. What Thomas didn't realize, however, was that his simple act of wrapping the girl in his blanket was not seen the same way in Apache culture. In many native traditions, among the Apache, blankets hold deep symbolic meaning. A blanket isn't just something to keep someone warm. It can represent protection, honor, and even commitment. And when a man gives a blanket to a young woman, particularly in a moment of need, it can be seen as a sacred gesture, a sign of deep respect, and in some tribes, a proposal of marriage. Thomas, of course, had no idea. In his mind, he had simply helped a freezing child survive a snowstorm. He hadn't thought twice about it. Giving her his blanket had been the obvious, human thing to do. But to the girl and, more importantly, to her tribe, it meant something far more serious. As night fell, the girl seemed more relaxed. She sat up a little straighter, sipped the last of her soup, and looked around the cabin with curious eyes. Her gaze finally settled on Thomas. She stared at him for a few moments, not fearfully, but thoughtfully. Then, without a word, she carefully folded the edges of the blanket around herself and lay down near the fire, as if accepting something silently. Thomas noticed this but didn't think much of it. He assumed she was just tired. "Get some rest," he said kindly, as he stood and stretched. "We'll figure things out in the morning." He laid out an extra bedroll for himself on the far side of the cabin and tried to fall asleep. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the wind continued to whistle outside. Everything seemed calm, but in a nearby village, deep in the woods, a different kind of conversation was happening. The girl's tribe had noticed her absence, and they were already searching for her. What they didn't expect, however, was that when they found her wrapped in a stranger's blanket, especially a man's, they would believe something far more significant had taken place. In the Apache tradition, the act had already spoken for him. And by morning, the cowboy's life was about to change in a way he never could have imagined. The next morning, the sky was clear and bright, though the snow still blanketed the ground outside like a soft white carpet. A gentle breeze blew through the trees, and the world seemed calm again after the storm. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but enough warmth remained to keep the room cozy. The girl was still asleep, curled up under the blanket near the hearth, her breathing soft and steady. Thomas smiled as he looked at her. She seemed peaceful, now safe and no longer shaking from the cold. Thomas quietly got up, added another log to the fire, and stepped outside to check on Dusty. The air was crisp and cold, and his breath formed clouds in front of his face. As he filled the water trough and brushed the snow off his saddle, he thought about the plan for the day. He would ride with the girl back to the direction of the Apache camp, ask around, and return her to her people. It would be simple, he thought, just a good deed completed. But things were about to take a surprising turn. He had barely finished brushing down Dusty when he heard the sound of voices, low and steady, coming from the trees beyond the fence. He turned, squinting, into the morning light. A group of figures was walking toward him, dressed in traditional Apache clothing. They moved calmly, but with purpose. There were 3 older men, 2 younger warriors, and 1 woman, perhaps a mother or elder. All of them wore serious expressions. Thomas stepped away from the horse and approached them carefully, his hands visible to show he meant no harm. "Morning," he said politely, nodding his head. "Can I help you?" The eldest man, who had long gray hair tied back and eyes filled with wisdom and strength, stepped forward. He looked Thomas over, then glanced at the cabin behind him. "You have our daughter," the man said in a calm but firm voice. Thomas blinked, a bit surprised. "You mean the girl I found yesterday? She was in the woods, freezing. I brought her here to warm up and keep her safe. She's inside, resting." The group exchanged quiet glances. The woman whispered something to one of the younger men. The elder stepped closer and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You gave her your blanket," he said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, she was freezing. It was all I had to warm her with." Another pause. The elder looked Thomas in the eye and said gently, but clearly, "Then you have married her." The words hit Thomas like a snowball to the chest. For a second, he thought he had misheard. I'm sorry, what? In our tradition, the elder continued, a man who gives a blanket to a young woman, especially in her time of need, makes a promise. It is a sacred act, a commitment of care, of union. You may not have known, but the gesture was clear. To us, Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. His heart began to race. Sir, I meant no disrespect. I didn't know about that tradition. I just ... I saw a child in danger and helped her. That's all. The Apache elder didn't seem angry, just understanding. We believe that actions speak louder than words. Your heart was good. Your choice was honorable. That is why we are not angry. But in our eyes, what is done cannot be undone. One of the younger warriors stepped forward. You gave her warmth. That is something sacred. Now she belongs to you, and you to her. Thomas turned and looked back at the cabin. Through the window, he could just see the girl sitting up now, wrapped in the blanket, her small face watching the scene outside. There was no fear in her eyes, calm, quiet acceptance. He turned back to the group. I didn't mean to propose anything. I just did what I thought was right. The woman finally spoke, and that is why you are worthy. Thomas stood there, stunned. He had no idea what to say. What started as a simple act of kindness was now being seen as a life-changing commitment. He wasn't angry, just confused, and maybe a little overwhelmed. Part of him wanted to explain further, to undo the misunderstanding. But another part of him wasn't sure it was a misunderstanding at all. Something bigger was happening here, something deeper than he yet understood. Thomas stood silently in the snow, his boots half buried, as the words echoed in his ears. Then you have married her. He had never felt more confused in his life. The snowflakes were no longer falling, but the cold felt sharper now, because of the weather, but because of the weight of what he had just heard. He looked at the elder, then at the other tribe members, and finally turned back toward the cabin. Through the small frosted window, the girl was still watching quietly, her face calm, her dark eyes steady. She wasn't panicked or upset. In fact, she looked as if she had been expecting this all along. That only made Thomas feel more unsure. I think there's been a mistake, Thomas said finally, turning back to the Apache visitors. I didn't mean for any of this. I saw a little girl freezing to death. I gave her my blanket so she wouldn't die. That's all. Where I come from, that's not a proposal, it's just a decent thing to do. The elder nodded slowly, his expression understanding, yet unshaken. We know your world is different from ours, he said gently. But in our ways, meaning does not come only from what a man says, it comes from what a man does. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, still trying to take it all in. But I didn't mean it that way, he said again, his voice a little desperate now. I don't even know her name. She doesn't know mine. The woman, elder, stepped forward, her voice soft but certain. She is called Iana. Her name means eternal blossom. She is strong, but she has no mother. Her father was taken by sickness last winter. She is not just a child, she is a daughter of our people, and you gave her warmth when the world turned its back. Thomas's breath caught, so she was alone. The sadness in her eyes made sense. Now, he felt a strange pull in his chest, a mixture of compassion, responsibility, and something else he couldn't yet name. The elder continued, in our tradition, when a man gives a girl his blanket, he offers protection not only for a night, but for life. It is not just a covering from the cold. It is a vow, a bond. You may not have known, but the spirit of your action was true. That is why we are here in peace. Thomas looked down at his hands. He remembered how carefully he had wrapped the blanket around Iana's tiny, shaking body. He hadn't thought about tradition or customs. He had just followed his heart. He didn't know their beliefs, but now, as they explained it, he felt something shift inside him. Still, he had to be honest. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that, he admitted, his voice quiet. I live alone. I don't have a family. I never even thought about marriage. The elder placed a firm, weathered hand on his shoulder. Neither had she. But sometimes the path chooses us, not the other way around. There was no pressure in his voice. No anger, no demand. Just a deep truth, calmly spoken. It was clear. They weren't forcing him. They had simply come to share what they believed his actions had meant. Thomas sighed and looked again toward the cabin. Iana had now turned away from the window, her small frame visible as she stood near the fireplace. In that moment, he thought about her again, alone in the snow, trembling, half frozen, and silent. She could have died out there. He had saved her life. And now, maybe he had become something more to her than just a stranger. I need time to think, he said honestly, his eyes still on the cabin. The elder gave a small nod. Of course, we will return soon, but remember, what you did was not small. In our eyes, it was sacred. With that, the group slowly turned and began to walk back into the trees, their quiet footsteps disappearing into the snow. Thomas remained standing there, the morning sun beginning to rise behind him, casting a long shadow across the white ground. He had set out that day to enjoy the peace of nature. Now, he stood on the edge of something far more complex, a moment where kindness, culture, and fate had woven together to change two lives forever. After the Apache visitors disappeared into the trees, silence settled once again over the snowy land. Thomas stood motionless for a long time, staring at the trail they had taken. His breath came out in soft clouds, and the only sound was the distant caw of a bird overhead. Inside, his thoughts raced. What had just happened? One moment, he was a lone cowboy doing a simple good deed. The next, he was being told that, according to an ancient tradition, he had become a husband. He turned slowly and walked back toward the cabin, each step crunching softly in the snow. His boots were heavy now, not just from cold or dampness, but from the weight of everything he was feeling: confusion, doubt, curiosity, and strangely, a quiet sense of responsibility. As he opened the wooden door, the warmth of the fire reached out to greet him. The scent of wood smoke and old pine filled the cabin. Ayanna stood near the fire, holding the wool blanket around her small frame. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes meeting his, searching his face not with fear, but with a gentle calm. Thomas closed the door behind him and walked toward her slowly. "You're feeling better?" he asked softly. She nodded. Yes, it was the first word she had spoken since he'd found her, and though it was just one word, it was clear and strong. Her voice was young but steady. Thomas sat down on the edge of the chair near the fire, unsure of what to say next. For a moment, they just sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle. He looked at her closely, now, not just as a child in need, but as a person with a name, a story, and a tribe behind her. Ayanna, eternal blossom. It suited her. "I didn't know," Thomas began carefully, "that giving you my blanket would mean so much to your people. I was just trying to help." Ayanna didn't answer right away. She sat cross-legged on the fur rug and looked at the fire. "I know," she said quietly. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You knew what it meant." She nodded slowly. "My grandmother told me if a man gives a girl his blanket in winter, he becomes her protector." He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to understand his own feelings. "And what do you think about that?" Ayanna shrugged gently. "You were kind. You didn't have to help me, but you did. That means something." Her words struck him harder than he expected. She didn't speak like a child. There was a maturity in her tone, the kind that came from loss, hardship, and growing up too fast. He remembered what the elder had said, that she had no mother, that her father had died, she was alone in the world, just as he had been for so long. "I live a quiet life," Thomas said slowly. "I've never taken care of anyone but myself. I don't know much about being someone's protector." Ayanna looked up at him again. "You already are," she said simply. Her words settled into the quiet air of the cabin like falling snow, gentle but heavy with meaning. Thomas stared into the fire for a long while. In his heart, he still wasn't sure what this new role meant or what the future would look like. He hadn't planned to become part of a family or to take responsibility for another life. But deep inside, something had shifted. He no longer saw Ayanna as just a girl he had rescued. She was someone who needed a place to belong, and perhaps, he realized, so was he. He looked back at her and offered a small, warm smile. "Well then," he said softly, "I guess we'll figure it out together." Ayanna smiled, too, just a little, but it was enough. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both were now a part of Dot, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel like a man alone in the world. He felt like someone needed, someone trusted, maybe even someone loved. Over the following days, the snow began to melt slowly under the soft winter sun. Icicles dripped from the edges of the roof, and the sound of water trickling from the hills filled the air like quiet music. Life around the cabin started to feel different, warmer, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Thomas and Ayanna settled into a rhythm. He taught her how to feed Dusty, how to collect firewood safely, and how to cook simple meals on the old iron stove. In return, Ayanna showed him how to weave strands of dried grass into rope, how to find edible berries even in the cold, and how to sit in silence without needing to fill it with words. Though they came from different worlds, they began to understand one another, not just through speech but through shared moments. The villagers in town were surprised when Thomas came riding in one morning with a quiet girl behind him. Wrapped in the same wool blanket that had started it all, people whispered and stared at first, curious about the child who now rode with the solitary cowboy. But when Thomas gently introduced her as Ayanna and explained that she was now living with him, most simply nodded with quiet respect. Some offered smiles. A few even brought small gifts of bread or fruit to welcome her. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden shadows over the land, Thomas sat with Ayanna outside the cabin. The snow had melted enough for the grass to peek through in patches. Ayanna was weaving a small bracelet from colored thread and dried seeds. Thomas watched her hands move quickly and carefully. He finally spoke, breaking the gentle quiet. "You know, if someone told me a week ago that giving someone a blanket would change my whole life, I would have laughed." Ayanna looked up, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're not laughing now," he chuckled. "No, I'm not." There was something beautiful in how it had all unfolded, how a simple act of kindness, given with no expectation, had led to something far greater. He hadn't planned to gain a family. He hadn't planned to be part of a tradition older than his own people's history. But life had chosen for him, and now he could see it wasn't a mistake, it was a gift. One evening, the Apache elder returned with 2 others to visit the cabin. This time, there was no confusion or surprise, only peace. They shared a quiet meal by the fire. Ayanna sat between Thomas and the woman elder, who gently braided her hair and sang softly in the Apache language. Before they left, the elder gave Thomas a hand-carved wooden pendant and placed it in his palm. This, the elder said, is not a reward. It is a reminder that when a man follows his heart, he sometimes walks into a story larger than himself. Thomas held the pendant for a long moment, then nodded. I understand that now. After they left, Thomas stood outside and watched their figures fade into the trees. The stars above shimmered, clear and bright, and the wind was gentle on his face. Behind him, Ayanna peeked through the cabin door, smiling softly. He turned and smiled back. That night, he sat by the fire as Ayanna drifted off to sleep nearby. He looked at the wool blanket she still kept close. The very same one he had once wrapped around her shoulders in the middle of a frozen forest. It wasn't just a blanket anymore, it was a symbol, a beginning, a quiet promise. And he realized something else. Perhaps the greatest changes in life don't come with loud moments or big decisions. Sometimes, they come in silence. In snow, in a simple act of care when no one else is watching. In the end, Thomas didn't become a hero, or a legend, or anything grand. But he became something more important. He became a protector, a friend, a family. And from that moment on, he was never truly alone again.